I'm not sure I can generalize that. I would just have to get the feeling of the individual, find out what their interests were, what they wanted to do. I went into archaeology because I like pretty pots and things like that. I like to find things in the ground that were interesting. I thought designs on Southwestern pots were something that had a mystery behind them, that kind of thing. I still think so. As I said, the field school at New Mexico was a very loosely organized thing, and the second season, 3 of us who were graduate students sort of ended up running things as 3 separate field crews. So there wasn't a very heavy relationship between faculty and us as students. And a little bit it was the blind leading the blind there, but we did some good work, actually. The other 2 students at that point were Charles McNutt, who went on to a career in the Southeast, and Jack Campbell, who for a long time headed the department in Albuquerque. So I knew these people for quite a long time. And in terms of my own work in the field, I never had a formal field school. I took students to the field. At Chicago, I took 2 students, to the Pecos Valley in New Mexico, where I did my dissertation research. I did the dissertation earlier before I got to that field work, before I got to Chicago. And like so many young PhDs, I was determined to go back to the scene of the crime and do it right. So I got an NSF grant while I was at Chicago and took 2 students out in the summer of 1960. And in terms of the last 2 the big field projects I did with students, the excavation at Taboon had a lot of students from Arizona, as well as some from other institutions around the country. It was basically 5 full field seasons. It's hard to enumerate all of those people and what they did and what they meant. A good number of them went on to be prominent professionals, and some of them went on here. Don Graybill, who you may have heard of, was eventually in the tree ring lab here, was one of my PhDs, did his research on environment in the Mimbrace area. I won't try and go back and go over any more than that. Don Graybill became a particularly close friend also after that time. He was seriously underappreciated, I think. He was a remarkable guy, as was Les Freeman. The field work in the last project at La Quina in France was a very different sort of thing. A number of others, the sort of second generation of Paleolithic students was part of that. I think best known is Harold Dibble and Phil Chase. And there were several other students from other universities who have gone on to professional careers from that. That was good. I had other field experiences, when I was at Michigan, Bob Braidwood at Chicago, who I had taught with, asked me to go out with them on the first field season in Turkey when they were looking for early villages in southeastern Turkey. And I learned some things about running a field project there as well. So I didn't go into it with a completely blank slate. You learn a lot from the students. I'm not sure how much they learn from me, but you learn a lot from them. I was told by a number of students that after Taboon that they realized that was the way to run a field project, so that was a nice thing to hear. These were professional projects, but we used the students in the project, and they learned from the way the project was done. You can talk about how to do field work endlessly in the classroom, and students can get very excited about that, but they don't really have any idea whether they're going to like doing that or be able to do that until they get out and do it. And it's the way it's where we derive our primary information. All those people we study are gone, and we have to look at mostly what they've discarded and didn't think was worth anything to try to interpret what they were doing and why they were doing it. And in terms of how to excavate, how to do a field project, I think the thing I always remembered most clearly was advice from Al Spalding, who said, try to take the site apart in such a way that you can put it all back together again. And it was the kind of thing I aimed for, as my friend Francois Borde, the French Paleolithic archaeologist, was fond of saying, there is no good excavation, just some are worse than others. So if you expose students to this and involve them in this kind of work, then they can learn about whether that's really what they want to do and whether they find something meaningful in it, and some don't. Well, Wakina is a perfect example. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first site excavated with computer technology. We had a total station at the site that was designed by Dibble. This was a fortuitous thing. It all fell together. Dibble was at the forefront of using computers in archaeology. He was instrumental. After Graybill did the initial work, he was instrumental in computerizing the data from Taboon. Graybill did the initial work, and then Dibble followed up with it. And so he designed a total station for recording information in the field as artifacts were being excavated. And I wasn't intelligent enough to use it in the field the way I should have been using it to keep tabs on what was going on in the excavation. I should have, but somehow it didn't register with me what I could do with that. I did it later, and I corrected a lot of problems in the excavation later because the data was all there. But that's one major thing. Now every excavation has a total station, and is computerized in terms of locating artifacts and that sort of thing. Much better than crossing two strings and other things that we used to do. Oh, I think it was fairly widely accepted early on. Everybody wanted to do it. And Dibble and his student McFerrin helped design programs for other sites, and he was simultaneously excavating at Conca-Pelbas, so applying it there as well. Digital scales became more and more accurate to a smaller degree, and that's what I used. At first, when you were buying digital scales, there was a great suspicion that you were going to use them for recreational pharmaceuticals, but that's no longer a problem, and wasn't in terms of the use. I used a small digital postal scale that measured down to a gram, and it was perfectly adequate. Susan Bearworth, one of the students at Lakina, who worked up until about the middle of the project, had bought a digital scale, but it only worked to 5 grams, so it wasn't quite as useful. I think my approach to archaeological analysis and interpretation has always been based in the simplest approach with the simplest techniques to see if one can find meaningful patterns. I have an absolute distrust of multivariate analysis. I don't think anybody knows what goes on in hyperspace. Maybe I'm Paleolithic in that regard, but I don't believe I've ever had from my perspective, I don't think of anything I've done as very profound. I tried to make some suggestions and contributions along the way. After the fieldwork in New Mexico, when I wrote up all of that material, I classified projectile points in a different way than people were doing, and people are still doing. I consider present projectile point classification as a kind of folk philately that enables a lot of communication between archaeologists who know what the typology should be and what particular forms should be named and that kind of thing. It leads to a lot of meaningful social interaction for these people. But in terms of the artifacts themselves, I think it can be done much more objectively. And I think given present techniques of computer imaging and that sort of thing, it will be primarily. But I put together a projectile point classification for the New Mexico material based on 2 stages of manufacture. One is the preform, the blank, as it's sometimes called, and the hefting modifications, the notching or formation of a stem, that kind of thing. And put those together like this, and came out with a lot of different pigeonholes. But when you looked at them all together and lumped them and did a seriation in the way we did seriation at that time with what's still being used is in the current networking studies called Brainerd-Robinson distance coefficients. It turned out that the projectile point seriation for the sites exactly duplicated the ceramic seriation. And I thought people would find that interesting, but nobody ever followed up on it. And I found that when one weighed the ceramics by type, as well as one counted the sherds, which is still being done, if you weigh them and you do a seriation, the differences are emphasized and the similarities are emphasized. And I tried to point that out, and nobody seems to have followed up on it. I think the explanation is very simple. There's a random factor of breakage in there. And what you're really looking at is mass of material of each kind. And it's better quantified by weight than it is by count. So I did that with material in New Mexico. I did demonstrate a sequence there that went from a Puebloan occupation to bison hunting by these same people. And it's on the eastern margin of New Mexico, over in the Pecos, and suggested that this, because these Puebloans were speaking probably Tewa languages, that this may be where the Kiowa came from, who also speak, they're the one Plains group speaks a Tewa language. In the middle of all that, in 1967, I wrote a paper for Jimmy Griffin's retirement volume called Form, Function, and Style in Lithic Analysis, in which I tried to deal with some things that people were saying about typology in industries and that kind of thing. But one thing I pointed out was that every stone artifact, every retouched artifact, has the potential of having had a very different form earlier on and being flaked and so on, and that everything has a potential of having gone through several typological forms before it reached its discard or loss. There was a student at Michigan, a superannuated student named George Frizen when I was teaching there. And George was analyzing a collection from a site called Piney Creek, in a bison kill site and campsite adjacent to each other. And he had a lot of distinctive raw materials that were easily recognized. And he was able to put things together from campsite and kill site, piece together artifacts to show how some of these had previously been something very different. And so I called this the Frizen effect after his work at Piney Creek, this concept. And I think it's one of the fundamental things that students have to realize, or any lithic analyst has to realize when they're classifying stone tool types and making industries out of stone tool types, that they're looking at one instant in time instead of a succession of forms. And you can expand that to archaeological sites and cultures as well. And what we're looking at are tiny little samples, little pinpoints of light here and there, widely scattered in time and in space, and we have these grand schemes of connecting them. Then in terms of material from Taboon, I did a lot of number crunching I was interested in measurements of artifacts and what they might show in terms of the techniques that produce them. And the sequence at Tabun is very long. It begins over 400. Material we did was started at the bottom of the deposits about 400,000 years ago and comes up to about 100,000 years ago. And I was able to show that if you take complete flakes, all of the complete flakes from each level, and you measure them, the variance of the ratio of width to thickness changes consistently up through the sequence for about 300,000 years. And I thought that was important. I thought it said something about cultural development, about people's ability to manipulate things. Two other people followed up on that, and someone who dug material very much earlier and someone who excavated material about the same time period. And both of them came out with consistent results with that. They were both in the Levant. So I don't know how far outside of the Levant this works, but it does work, I think. I only tested one deep site for this in France, and it seemed to work. But there weren't the sequences there to duplicate what we had in the Levant. So I think this is something that might be tested somewhere else. These are the kinds of things I was trying to do in looking for patterns in the past that might be significant for something about human development. I've been out of the department, you see, for 20 years now. The most obvious change I've seen recently is the incorporation of people from other units in the university, which I think is a very good thing. There was talk of this earlier on, of more cooperation with the classical archaeologists, but it, for various reasons, it never got very far. And I think this is a very exemplary development. Early on and going through, that's all quite a long time ago for me now. The department simply grew, for the most part, in a very good way, I think. I remember I was very happy when Jerry Levy came to the department. Jerry was my first TA at Chicago. And he was always a very sensible guy. And I think he was the last of the real ethnologists. He was a remarkable person. His father brought this first major exhibition of European surrealists to this country. His father was Julian Levy, the art dealer in New York. But Jerry was a remarkable guy. In terms of directions and change, of course, the new archaeology was active here when I got here. Bill Longacre was a student at Chicago when I was teaching there. He claims he came to Chicago because I was teaching there. I remember that Ian Elaine Bloom and I and Constance Cronin, who later came here, had a little conference to discuss the ceramic samples he had collected the summer before with Paul Martin. And we talked about the possibility that the levels of patterning there represented household, community, village, region, that sort of thing, and suggested he go out looking for further samples with that kind of thing in mind. And I guess that's the sort of thing that led to his archaeology as anthropology dissertation at Chicago. Oh, there was a fellow named Binford there who had some influence on him. Not one of my favorite people, as is widely known. Two of the people who were most prominent in my memories of the department were Ray Thompson and Emil. At that point, I don't think Emil had very much influence in the way in which the department was growing. It was Ray who was able to make that expansion possible. Ray's feeling, I think, was to try to keep all four fields strong. At the same time, I think the influence of cultural anthropologists was very heavy. The department, though, was, I think, to a large degree dominated by archaeologists for much of that time. I don't think that's true anymore, but I'm seeing it from the outside now. I think the discipline has diversified in so many ways that it's impossible to adequately cover it all. Maybe it was always like that in some ways. I remember someone asking Leslie White, another of my favorite old characters out of the Pantheon, what is anthropology? And Leslie said, well, anthropology is what anthropologists do. When I was trained and first started out, cultural anthropology was basically ethnology. And it has become the most diversified, I think, of the subdisciplines, if in fact it is still a subdiscipline. I think Leslie would have disparaged the term cultural anthropology, because what makes anthropology is interest in culture. It's what makes physical anthropologists different from human biologists, and anthropological linguists different from other linguists. I see things as diversifying beyond a point that I can sometimes understand. Archaeology took a number of different turns while I was here. We had archaeologists doing things that were not involved with field work and collection of data from the field. And I wasn't always happy about that. And I suspect some of my colleagues were not either. But it was fashionable, and it brought attention to the department, and sometimes money. So I'm an old stick in the mud when it comes to archaeology. I think you're not an archaeologist unless you have one foot in the ground. You can have the other one behind the desk, but you always need some connection with what's coming out of the archaeological record. There's an awful lot of what I refer to as let's pretend archaeology or let's play archaeology. And that's all well and good, but can you do anything with it that really represents what's happening or what did happen in the past? Can you verify it? As long as I was active in the department, that was where it was. The archaeologists were, some of them people who worked in the ground and some of them did not. It was a prevalent pattern, really, in a lot of schools. Harvard and the Peabody. And I think that's probably the oldest of those relationships. The museum at Penn and the department. Ann Arbor, Berkeley. There was no such relationship that well, I guess, Columbia and the American Museum, Margaret Mead was in both, other people. I think it's a pattern that grew out of anthropology at that time. Anthropology was, with its emphasis on ethnology and archaeology as primary disciplines, and physical anthropology as well, access to collections and specimens was crucial to the development of the discipline. And so that's where the relationship was. And it was a similar relationship here, the way the museum was incorporated with Cummings. Cummings integrated students with the artifacts in their training in the museum, the same way as was done in these other institutions. With less emphasis on archaeology and artifacts in archaeology, that connection seems to have weakened here. And I think this might be rethought in terms of both modern material culture or ethnographic material culture and ancient culture. I think familiarity there gives, again, a perspective you can't get out of books. There was a big difference in teaching here from Michigan, because at Michigan I was half-time in the museum and half-time in the department. So I had a half-time teaching load, basically. Well, in the late 60s, early 70s, a group of us used to go to lunch over at the Park Center, where they had a nice buffet lunch. And it was mostly younger faculty, Basso and Levy and Bleibtreu and Walt Birkby, and sometimes Longacre. We were sitting around one day, and I think it was Jerry Levy who said, I don't know what it is. He said, I'm having a hard time this semester with lectures. He said, I know when I give a good lecture, and I know the way students ought to respond to it. And I'm just not really getting those responses. And everybody looked at him, and we all said, you too? And it seemed to us it was a phenomenon that was common for everybody. We tried to figure it out. And our best conclusion was that we were facing the first generation that had grown up with television. And they would come in, and they would turn us on, and they would listen, and they'd hoped for some amusement, and at the end of the lecture, they would turn it off and go out. There were some students who were more enthusiastic and were obviously more involved in what you were saying. And so we started trying to talk to them. And almost invariably we found out that for some reason or another, they had not grown up with television. It was a revelation. And from that point on, you realize that these kids were hoping for entertainment, a lot of them. And if they didn't get entertainment, they weren't interested. And it was a real change in students. Nobody here now knows what those students before that were like. But I taught them for at least 10 years before that. I could still, once in a while, get a class interested and excited. But it wasn't the sort of thing that you felt you knew how to do earlier. I didn't make any changes. I just said this is the kind of material that people ought to know, to understand, as I see the discipline. And so I didn't go into a soft shoe dance or anything else. Some of my colleagues were very good at it. Bleibtreu was a superb lecturer, particularly for undergraduates, and could carry them along. He was a born entertainer, I suppose. But I wasn't like that. I suspect Basso was pretty good at that too. But I could never get in that mode. It changed gradually after that to students who were less and less able to write and less able to read and understand. More and more students like that. I don't know whether that had to do with the general university admissions policy or with changes in high school education, grade school education. I don't know. But by the time I stopped teaching, I wasn't I was very seldom able to really feel I had read something that I could understand and that was clearly written. And then it was the beginning of getting these wonderfully excellent term papers and wondering how a student could be so poorly expressive. The exact words I want don't come as easily as they did. But wondering how a student could write like they did on an exam and write such an excellent term paper. And I finally started getting to that by putting a question on the final exam: will you discuss the basic results and contributions of your term paper? And the results were generally pretty deplorable. Now there are search engines to find those kinds of coincidences. But we were seeing the beginning of it 20 years ago when I was last teaching. Oh, the information world now is a two-edged sword, particularly in academia, I think. And we haven't seen the beginning of it yet. Homo sapiens isn't fixed. I could go on and on about Homo sapiens, but I won't. I think each of the archaeologists had a different approach to teaching. I don't know that I can say that there was a trend toward differences. I tended to teach what we knew came out of the ground, and I was not particularly interested in theory. I don't think that way, basically. Some people do. Some people think in terms of numbers, some people think in terms of words, some in terms of concepts. I think in terms of images, I think. Graphic relationships, that sort of thing. I was happy with the Taboon excavation. I think it was reasonably good for the time in which it was done. I'm fairly happy with the Lakina excavation. There are things I would have done differently if I had known some of what was happening. I can't think of, outside of finding particular relationships and seeing them and, oh, that works. That's saying something. Those are the kinds of things that have been most meaningful to me. Once in a while there'll be a discovery of something in the ground, but people don't realize what a tedious, boring thing archaeological fieldwork is. It's basically a matter of bookkeeping. The better bookkeeper you are with the material that's coming out of the ground, as well as the accounts of the project, the better the results are going to be, the more reliable the results are going to be. Next to the last season at Lakina, we uncovered a Neanderthal occiput, the first sizable piece of Neanderthal bone. And we uncovered 3 complete hand axes. We'd had lots of indication that there was a hand axe industry there, but just a few fragments. And Leon Lawrenson, who was a superb field crewman and assistant eventually, called me over to the site. I was in the lab. He said, I think we have something you'd be interested in seeing. And he had been excavating in an upper layer. There were 3 complete hand axes sitting there, which is an indication this isn't just chance because of the amount of material we had moved. But obviously they'd been deliberately left there together or abandoned accidentally together. And that was nice, but it wasn't a high point in the sense you're talking. High points for me came from seeing some of those relationships and saying, oh, maybe that means something, maybe that's useful. It's really where we came from and where in some respects we still are as Homo sapiens. This was our biological selection. Now there's less and less restriction in that direction. But I think that unless we understand what kind of creature it was in terms of abilities and accomplishments, that sort of thing, at various times in the Quaternary past, we're going to fall far short in trying to figure out what people are doing now. Doesn't mean I recommend the paleo diet. But I think there are deeply ingrained patterns of human behavior that are the result of that enormously long period of selection. In terms of Paleolithic archaeology itself, there's no predicting. Eventually, we may even be able to see through dirt. But I think that techniques of computer imaging and analysis of images are going to be increasingly important in identifying patterns of artifact manufacture and their interpretation. I think that study of projectile points I did that I was talking about, I hope that will be superseded by a more objective set of observations that can be quantifiably analyzed, that will really show us whether there are meaningful types. And I suspect that we'll see them only in terms of particular regional situations. We can see the same type of triangular side notch point beginning at Teotihuacan and all over the lot at Cahokia and coming into the Southwest somewhat later. Basically, those points had a better ability to penetrate because there was less projecting beyond the shaft itself. And from the Castaneda narrative, the Indians were using those kinds of points when they were observed by the Coronado expedition. They were able to shoot an arrow through a bison because there was less resistance with that form of point. It's been a good time for me here. I've always been happy I ended up here. Can't think of any place I would have been happier. I think for me this has been a very good place, and it's been very good to me.